Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It's Wednesday, the 15th of January in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, South Korea's President Yoon Suk Yeol is arrested over an investigation into his martial law declaration.
The UK's City Minister resigns after an ethics review amid pressure on the Labour government.
And a last-minute push from Joe Biden. The outgoing US president plans new rules to limit chip exports to China.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
South Korea's President Yoon Suk Yeol has been arrested over his brief declaration of martial law last month. Anti-corruption investigators detained the leader in a raid before dawn. In a video message recorded before he was led away, Yoon said the rule of law in the country had completely collapsed.
Today, I witnessed them forcibly breaching a secured zone using firefighting equipment. To prevent any unsavoury bloodshed, I have decided to comply with the summons by the Corruption Investigation Office, despite their investigation being illegal. However, I am not acknowledging the CIO's investigation.
Yoon has been stripped of presidential powers and now awaits a formal impeachment trial. Investigators are examining whether his martial law declaration amounts to an act of insurrection, though Yoon has argued it was within his power as president to issue the order.
To the UK, where the City Minister has resigned from government. Tulip Siddiq will be replaced by former City lobbyist Emma Reynolds after an ethics review into allegations around Siddiq's use and receipt of properties linked to the ousted Bangladeshi regime. Though the probe found that she had not breached the ministerial code, Siddiq says she's stepped down to avoid becoming a distraction. The news comes as Chancellor Rachel Reeves tried to calm investors spooked by a surge in UK borrowing costs and ahead of crucial inflation data due this morning.
I set out the fiscal rules of this government at the budget in October, that we will pay for day-to-day spending through tax receipts and that we will get debt down as a share of the economy. We remain committed to those fiscal rules and we will meet them at all times.
Rachel Reeves speaking in Parliament yesterday. There is still potential for the market pressure to intensify again this week, with economists warning that the Bank of England could be forced to intervene if we see a higher than expected inflation print today, combined with weaker growth data, which is due out on Thursday.
In the US, the Biden administration is planning to impose tough new rules on exporting advanced chips to China. Bloomberg has learned the White House intends to announce the measures in the last few days of the current presidency. The changes would require a license to sell semiconductors with processing power below a 14-nanometer threshold.
Donald Trump's pick to run the Pentagon appears on course to get the job after a US Senate hearing. Republicans rallied around Pete Hegseth, who dismissed accusations of past alcohol abuse, sexual misconduct and financial mismanagement.
What became very evident to us from the beginning, there was a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated in the media against us. That was clear from moment one.
A former Fox News host, Peter Hegseth, and his confirmation is seen as a sign of the president-elect's power. Donald Trump says that he will create an external revenue service tasked with collecting tariffs on foreign imports. Analysts and Democrats have pointed out that tariffs are already collected by the US Customs and Border Protection Agency.
US consumer prices are expected to show a fifth month of increases as the market bets on inflation fears. Analysts expect the Bureau of Labour Statistics to report a 0.3% rise in core inflation later today. If correct, the data would boost the case for an extended pause in Federal Reserve interest rate cuts. The figures come at a critical time for investors and policymakers, with the yield on 10-year Treasury notes up more than half a percentage point since the last print.
The European Central Bank is pushing back against investors who think that rate cuts are off the table. Markets see firmer inflation, a stronger US jobs market and Donald Trump's economic disruption keeping interest rates high around the world. But Finland's Olli Rehn is one of a number of ECB policymakers pointing to the growth outlook.
Inflation is stabilizing at our 2% target. Employment is holding up. It's robust. On the minus side, the growth outlook has weakened. It's fairly subdued.
Olli Rehn speaking to Bloomberg there earlier this week. He was joined by Francois Villeroy de Gallo and Yanis Stournaras, who have doubled down on forecasts of 100 basis point cuts for the ECB by the middle of the year.
And dozens of people are missing in Los Angeles as high winds raise further wildfire risks. Around 2 million people are facing extreme fire conditions, with 88,000 residents under evacuation orders and another almost 85,000 under warnings. President Biden has offered his support to those affected.
The heart of the nation are with the victims and families left behind, and all the people who've lost their homes, livelihoods, and so much to these fires. Yet another reminder, tragedy like this is not about blue states and red states, not about conservatives and liberals. It's about the United States of America.
President Joe Biden was speaking as conditions are expected to improve towards the end of the week, giving authorities a better chance to control the blazes, which have already killed 24 people. Total losses for the insurance industry as a result of the destruction are estimated to be as high as $40 billion, according to analysts.
Those are our top stories for you this morning. In terms of the markets, Asian stocks seeing some pretty choppy trading ahead of the US CPI print today. You've got the MSCI Asia Pacific Index currently in the red. Shares of TSMC falling 2% after that news out of the US, the push to tighten chip flows to China. The PBOC in China has dialed up liquidity injections. Also, when it comes to Japan, the BOJ policymaker Ueda keeping the door open for a January interest rate hike. The Japanese yen strengthening this morning, up 0.4%. 2-year Japanese bond yields rising to the highest since 2008. Yesterday, of course, in terms of the other main story in markets, 30-year Treasury yields touched 5% again, the second time this week. The gilt rout took a bit of a pause. The dollar fell yesterday. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index this morning is down again. And looking at stock futures for the European market open, currently we're up 0.1%. So those are the markets.
In a moment, we'll bring you more on the arrest of South Korea's impeached president, plus what the latest we've heard from the US on those moves to try and limit exports of chips to China. And we'll also be discussing the resignation of the city minister here in the UK. But it's actually another story that I wanted to talk about first to do with the UK. And this is to do with the AI strategy, one of the big parts of the government's plans to create growth in the UK, unveiled earlier this week. Bloomberg Opinion columnist Parmi Olsen's been giving her take of the new plan. And essentially, she sees it as a bit of a misfire by the government. She says the strength that the UK has always been that middle ground in terms of regulation between the US and the EU. But Keir Starmer's plan is vague. It doesn't contain numbers that seem achievable and doesn't account for, when trying to calculate the economic benefits, that investment now might take years to pay off down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that we did a whole number of interviews, didn't we, around that AI strategy that was unveiled. The government is under pressure to deliver on some of its promises. When we spoke to a number of people involved in artificial intelligence, they did seem to be making this clear request for more clarity, for a stronger kind of guardrail really from the UK government on Monday. I mean, Parmi also making this point that actually Britain has this leading role as a safety regulator and that more should be made of that. But it certainly does seem that the industry had high hopes and they haven't got it. Maybe the government, though, is caught up, obviously, given the market turmoil that we've seen in the last week to 10 days.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the CPI figures out this morning as well, going to add to the focus on the UK economy. Let's turn, though, to South Korea first, where investigators have arrested President Yoon Suk Yeol over his brief declaration of martial law just over a month ago. Our reporter Sam Kim joins us from Seoul for more. Sam, thanks for joining us. This was the second attempt to arrest the impeached leader. What happened?
Well, basically, it all began with Yoon declaring martial law on December 3rd in the middle of the night, where he sent troops to the National Assembly, which is a place that he called a den of criminals that houses pro-North Korea sympathizers trying to paralyze the government. The opposition quickly ended the martial law imposition with a motion. And ever since, the opposition has charged him with with insurrection. And this charge allows for an investigation against a sitting president within the Constitution. So prosecutors sought to question him, which Yoon refused. So prosecutors managed to secure an arrest warrant against him. But the first attempt to detain Yoon for questioning failed. And now the second attempt, which took place today, turned out to be a success, with presidential guards apparently opening the pathway to Yoon's residence, possibly either because Yoon didn't want to risk a physical conflict with prosecutors and police, or because the police were determined enough to brave such a conflict, and the presidential guards backed off, basically. More details of what happened will emerge in coming hours and days.
But what happens now in terms of the investigation against him?
Yoon will be in police custody for 48 hours. During that period, the team of anti-corruption prosecutors will likely try to get another arrest warrant that would allow them to detain him for up to 20 days. And that would put Yoon behind bars, and that would make him the first president in Korea's history to be jailed while he's in office. Even though the impeachment motion passed against him last month has already suspended him from duty. For now, we're hearing reports that Yoon's exercising his right to remain silent. And at the same time, there's a separate legal proceeding going on against him at the Constitutional Court, which has several months to determine if the impeachment motion against him is valid. If the court says yes, Yoon will no longer be president, and there'll be a snap election to replace Yoon.
What does all of this mean for the running of the country and the economy?
Well, if this snap election is held, we're likely to see a variety of presidential runners trying to replace Yoon, and one of those would likely be the main opposition chief named Lee Jae-myung, because he's been the front runner in presidential polls for some months now. It's kind of unclear who would represent Yoon's bloc, but if polls are a decent guide of what's to happen, the next president of the country is likely to be someone who has been at odds with Yoon over a variety of policies, from taxes to fiscal policy to relations with the U.S. and China. So you can kind of expect a reversal of a lot of the policies that we've been seeing under Yoon. And of course, it would mean a certain level of disruption of continuity in economic policy, and that would not bode so well for South Korea when export growth is moderating and the country is concerned already about tariff plans by Donald Trump, who's coming back to office next week.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, thank you so much for being with us and explaining the situation in South Korea. Our reporter Sam Kim there joining us live from Seoul.
Here in the UK, the City Minister has resigned from her job after an ethics review into allegations around her use and receipt of properties linked to the ousted Bangladeshi regime. Tulip Siddiq quit despite being cleared of wrongdoing in an investigation, saying she was acting to avoid distraction for the government at a time when Labour is under pressure over the fiscal situation. Our reporter Tiwa Adebayo is here with more. Tiwa, why did Tulip Siddiq resign now?
This is a saga that's been going on really for quite a while now. The Prime Minister has been facing calls to dismiss her for months, and that's because, as you mentioned, ongoing allegations that she's benefited from properties that may have been acquired with funds embezzled by the regime of Sheikh Hasina in Bangladesh. That's Tulip Siddiq's aunt. And these calls are coming especially because part of her brief as a city minister, included in that, was fighting corruption. It seems things might have finally come to a head as those calls have kept getting louder, and last week she did refer herself to the Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial interests, Laurie Magnus. Now, Laurie Magnus said in his review, his formal review into this matter, that there was no wrongdoing, no financial impropriety on the part of Tulip Siddiq, but he did say that her involvement in the scandal was regrettable given her ministerial position. So she says she's resigning now to avoid becoming a further distraction to government work and the work of the Treasury.
So she's being replaced by Emma Reynolds, someone with links to the financial services sector, quite well known in the City of London.
Yeah, that's right, Caroline. So Emma Reynolds, until last year, she was the chief lobbyist for the City UK, which is a trade group that represents banks here in London's financial centre. Now, this appointment shows that the government is keen to still uphold those links with the City of London, particularly at a time when, as the Chancellor and other ministers have hammered home in recent weeks. They're really trying to harness the power of the UK's financial sector to drive economic growth, which has proven elusive so far. And there's no doubt the Prime Minister will be hoping that Reynolds can leverage some of those city links and contacts to help with that mission.
Tiwa, what does this news mean for the government at a time when they're facing many other challenges, as we've been reporting?
Well, this really couldn't be coming at a worse time for the government, especially the Treasury. It was just in November last year that the last high-profile minister quit. That's Louise Haigh, the Transport Secretary. And now we've got the City Minister resigning at a time when the Treasury is facing really high levels of scrutiny. That's after the huge spike in UK borrowing costs that we've seen over the last week, and even questions about Rachel Reeves's future in her role as Chancellor. So it's not an ideal time for the government at all, especially as we're facing a pivotal economic data release today in the form of the latest UK inflation numbers. We have the City Minister stepping down on the eve of that important data release. Not ideal for a government that's trying to communicate stability and credibility to an already quite jittery UK market.
Yeah, the timing's certainly strange. Tiwa, thank you so much for being with us. That is our reporter Tiwa Adebayo there on the resignation of the City Minister, Tulip Siddiq.
The United States is planning to introduce new regulations to prevent advanced chips being sold to China, targeting chip producers like TSMC, Samsung and Intel. This coming just days ahead of Donald Trump taking office, with the incoming president saying he wants to create an external revenue service to collect tariffs on foreign imports. Our EMEA News Director Rosalind Matheson joins us now for more. Ros, good morning. What are the new rules being planned by the Biden administration targeting China? And I suppose, how significant are they, given that we're only a couple of days away from the inauguration of Donald Trump?
Well, it's a part of this effort that seems to be happening from the Biden administration in the waning days to get as much stuff done as they can before they're out the door, begging the question why they didn't do it really previously, but certainly very busy, you'd have to say, in their final weeks on everything from the Middle East to Cuba and to chips. And of course, this comes after the news on NVIDIA as well, which is about managing the flow of AI chips. And this is in the same realm. It's really about the very high end of the chip market, so 14 to 16 nanometers or less, very powerful processing chips. And it's less about penalising, but more about really encouraging in a way and leaning on companies like TSMC to explore their supply chain. Where exactly are your chips going? Who are your customers? Who are they selling on to? And this follows, of course, the news that some time ago that TSMC chips turned up in Huawei kit. And that's the concern, is that eventually these things find their way through to some Chinese companies. And it's about saying to them, be very careful about your supply chain, work out who your customers are when it comes to these very high-level chips. But this is more of an overlay move than something very startling on its own.
The timing is important, isn't it? It's only a few days until Donald Trump takes over. He is doubling down on rhetoric around trade tariffs. What more have we learned?
Well, he's talking about setting up this external revenue service, which is a bit of a cutesy title to use, but no more detail than that. Is this just a way to describe what's already happening? Because tariffs are already collected through the border, through the border mechanisms that exist, and it's only about 2%, obviously, and maybe he wants that to go up. But, there is a mechanism through customs and border protection already. Is he describing something that already exists? And anyway, you don't actually collect the revenue externally. It's really collected from US consumers. And this is the broader concern about tariffs and imposing blanket tariffs internationally, is that the impact can be really felt on the US consumer and then on inflation. And that's the boomerang effect of tariffs that we're talking about. So this is really a rhetorical flourish, if anything, from Donald Trump, and very unclear if he means anything tangible to change.
Been tracking, of course, all that commentary very closely as we count down to the inauguration. Another story that we have been following to do with Elon Musk, accused by the SEC of cheating Twitter shareholders in the run-up to his takeover of the social media platform. Is this going to be damaging for Musk and given his proximity to Donald Trump?
Well, he sort of flagged a number of months ago that this was in the wings, and from dating back to obviously 2022, we know the SEC has been looking at this acquisition and mainly about Musk's transparency or potential lack thereof through the process. It doesn't seem to be inferring at this point that he did anything deliberate. It's almost like they failed to file paperwork or something, or, they're not saying that he was duplicitous here. It's just that somewhere along the line, notifications weren't done that should have been done in the process of building stakes in companies. And therefore, if he had alerted the world that he was building this stake, the shares would have gone up and that would have had an impact for others. And so it's the question of transparency. Does it really affect Musk? He faces lots of different lawsuits every day, and he's a very, very wealthy man. And a bit like Trump, he likes to parlay these moments into, bravado for himself, right? Like, very much like Donald Trump says, look, I've got all these cases against me. They're conspiracies against me. I'm being targeted. All I'm trying to do is, represent the country or something, or do my business. And so very much in the vein of that, you can imagine that Musk is going to come out with that kind of rhetoric. Does it really impact him and his business in a negative way? Very unlikely.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.